Now, a while back, I saw a very interesting little idea for player possession while in VR. Now, while this isn't very commonly seen in many VR titles that you see today, it is a very interesting little mechanic and can often lead to some very interesting experiences while you're in VR. So in this tutorial, I'm going to walk you through how to set up player possession within your own VR game. But before we go and jump into that, if you enjoy this video and want to see more just like this one, be sure to hit the like and subscribe button down below. And while you're down there, be sure to let me know what other types of tutorials that you would like to see in the future. And with that, let's go ahead and jump right into the video. So I've gone ahead, I've opened up a project here. I've done nothing to this so far. However, we will need to make some changes here to the template or to our map here. I'll make these changes at the end though, once we have finished with our player controller and our player as well, because we'll need to make some changes to both the player as well as make our own player controller. So let's go ahead and get started here. I'm going to go and start by opening up our content browser. I'm going to create a new folder. I'm going to go and call this Blueprints. Go and open that up, and we'll want to make a new Blueprint class. I'm going to make this a player controller, and I'll go and call this PC for player controller and underscore possession, and we'll go and open that up. Now, the way that possession works in Unreal Engine, well, let me back up here for a sec. So possession allows for us to basically, as the term implies, possess either a pawn, a character, or I believe there's a couple of other types of classes that we're able to possess as well. And the whole idea of possessing is that it will allow for us to control that specific actor. So what we're going to do is, in order to be able to possess, we need access to our player controller. And rather than just simply access our player controller, what I would much rather do is actually control this all from within the player controller itself, as it'll just make it a little bit easier as well. We don't have to worry about passing around variables to figure out what player we're currently on. We don't need to worry about trying to figure out what player we're currently on. Everything can be managed from within the player controller itself. So we're going to actually end up making two custom events. So let me actually go and make those real quick. So we'll make two custom events. The first one will allow for us to go on to whatever the next player is. And I'm just going to call this next player possess. And our second one, let's go and create another custom event, will allow for us to go on to whatever the previous player that we should possess is. So this will allow for us to choose what player we want to go on to. So if we have, hundreds or thousands of players for whatever reason, we can choose which one we want to go on to. It'll simply choose whatever the next player is or whatever the previous player is, and it will simply go on to that player. And that'll just kind of simplify things a lot here. So let's go ahead and get started here. I'm going to go ahead and get all actors of class. And we want to get all of our players. So the class that I'm going to use, it's going to differ if you're in Unreal Engine 4. So I'm in Unreal Engine 5. So if I go into VR template blueprints, this is my player pawn, VR pawn. If you're working in Unreal Engine 4, I believe it's called motion controller pawn or BP motion controller pawn, something to that effect. The Unreal Engine 4 players split into 2 or 3 different parts. So it'll be called something like that though. But you want to find whatever the class type of your player is. So I'm using a VR pawn, so I'm going to go ahead and put that in here. And we're going to do a couple things here. So let's go ahead and start by pulling out the length here. And then we actually need an index that we can use to figure out what player we're currently on. So let's go ahead and create a variable that will represent that. And I'll just call it current player index. And I actually want to change this to an integer. There we go. And then let's go ahead and get this current player index. Now, the length actually tells us how many of this type of actors there are. So if there's 3, then there will actually be 3. Then it'll actually output 3. If there's 4, it'll output 4, so on and so forth. Now we can actually use this to our advantage here because that's not the way that we want it to work. When we actually try and grab one of our actors from here, it actually won't if we have, for example, 3 actors, it won't actually allow for us to go up to 3. It'll allow for us to go up for 2 because we'll have actors in indexes 0, 1, and 2 rather than 1, 2, and 3. So if these two are actually equal to each other, our current player index, actually not our current player index because we actually need to increase this by 1 because we're going to the next one. So let's actually add 1 to that. And then if these two are equal to each other, then we know that we've kind of reached the end of our list here, and we basically need to go back to the beginning or do nothing at all. For this example, I'm just going to go ahead and go back to the beginning, so we can just go ahead and set our current player index back to 0. And otherwise, we're going to go ahead and set it to our current player index plus 1. And that'll kind of work there. There we go. Now from here on, it's going to be pretty much the same, regardless of what you're doing here. So let's go ahead and get our current player now. Let me actually go and move this forward a little bit so we have a little bit of organization here. There we go. There we go. Try and keep it a little bit organized there. All right. Now here at the end, we'll want to go ahead and get whatever our current player index is, since that has now been set at this point. And then we actually want to possess the pawn that we get here. There we go. And that's kind of it. So that will handle our possession. It will allow for us to possess the next player pretty simply, and we'll actually end up calling this from within our player as well. And we'll get to that in just 1 second. For now, let's go ahead and jump down here to our previous player possession. And I'm actually going to go and copy this real quick and bring this down because we'll be able to reuse some of this. So let me go ahead and so some of this we won't be able to use. So we're not going to be basing it off of the length here in this case. And we actually won't need to add 1, we'll actually need to subtract 1. So let's go ahead and subtract 1 here. We'll start there. And assuming that this is equal to 0, then we want to find whatever the length of our actors are, and we'll want to subtract 1 from that, and that will tell us what player we should be going to. So let's go ahead, I'll go and bring this up again, and we'll go ahead and subtract 1 here. And this is going to be fed into our current player index there. Otherwise, what we'll want to do is we'll just want to pass in our current player index minus 1. And that everything else will be fully taken care of. We won't have to worry about anything else beyond this point. So I was looking through this and I realized I actually did something wrong here. I actually was checking to see if this index was equal to 0. And that's actually not correct. And that wasn't something I caught on to when I was trying to go through this. We actually want to see if it's less than 0. And the reason for this is if it's equal to 0, it means it's the very first index, which means that we'll never be able to go back to the very first index. So I actually want to go ahead, I want to find if this is less than 0. And if it's less than 0, then that's what we want to do. Otherwise, like I said, we'll never be able to go back to that to the very first player. We'll be able to go forward to it, but we won't be able to go back to this very first. While we're here in our player controller, we actually need to find a way to possess our first player. Whatever it finds is our first player. And this is actually pretty simple to do. All we'll need to do is we'll want to get begin play. And we're going to, again, want to get all actors of VR pawn. Get all actors of class. And VR pawn. I did not mean to do that, but that works too. And then we'll just want to get a copy. Now, our current player index by default is set to 0, so we can honestly just leave this at 0. If you plan on changing this for whatever reason, then I would probably suggest bringing this in and passing that into our integer here to figure out what index we want to use. But since we're just at the begin play, our current player index is equal to 0. So I'm just going to go ahead and leave this as is, and we'll just want to go ahead and possess our actor there. There we go. And that's all that we need to do here for setting up our initial player here. Now this should handle all of our basic possession here. So all we'll need to do now is use this in our project. Now if you've never assigned a player controller, there's two different ways to do it. One is we can actually go into our maps and modes and we can manually input a player controller that we want to, this will essentially override whatever the default is. And if we want to change our default player controller, we can actually go over here into our game mode. And actually, I think I can pull this one up. I can show you here. We can actually go into our game mode and we can actually change our default player controller for this game mode. I won't use that method. I'll actually go ahead and jump over here into our project settings and just go and change our player controller. It'll just be a little bit easier. The only other thing I want to do while we're here is I also want to disable our VR pawn, set that to none, because I want to make sure that we won't have a default pawn class that'll interfere with whatever our player controller is doing here. And with that, let's go ahead and jump over into our player now. Now here on our player, we'll need to do a couple of just quick things here. So let's go ahead and start by actually figuring out when we need to possess a new player. So I'm going to go ahead and override our triggers for this example. Since we don't have any objects that we need to detect trigger presses for. So I'm going to go and take our trigger left input action and our trigger right input action. Let's go and bring this down a little bit. And we'll want to do a couple things here. So we first want to get our player controller, and we actually need to be able to cast to our player controller. So our player controller is called PC possession. So I'm actually going to cast this to PC possession. And I'll do this on pressed. You can do it on either pressed or release. I would suggest doing it on both, because then anytime you press, you'll possess twice. Once on press and once on release. And then we'll go ahead and call, this is left, so we'll go and call previous player possess. And otherwise, let's go and copy this portion down here. And then on right press, we'll want to jump to whatever our next player possess is. So let's go and do next player possess, and we'll go and jump there. Now there's one more thing that we're going to want to do here as well. Assuming that we actually possess a new player, which should happen since that's being managed by the player controller, there is one issue that will come up. So if we actually jump over here into our viewport, you can actually see we have two motion controller components. These motion controller components will remain active regardless of whether or not you are currently possessing this current pawn. It will remain active the entire time. So in order to fix this, what we want to do is we want to, there's actually a couple ways to do it, but the easiest one that I found is to simply disable our motion source here, and then re-enable it later on once we come back to possess our player. So let's go ahead and jump over to our event graph here. And I want to get both of our motion controller components. Let's go and grab both of those. And I want to, once we have decided we want to possess, then we actually want to come in here and we want to set motion source. And our default here will actually be none, which actually works out perfectly for us. So we'll want to set that for both of our motion controller components here. There we go. And let me go and move this to the end here. This should still work here at the end. And then we'll want to do the same as well if we come over here to the right. There we go. And we will, and we'll want to do if we go and possess our next player as well. Basically, whenever we go to possess a new player, we want to make sure that our motion source is set to none. That'll just kind of simplify things down, and we won't see our other motion controller components moving around with us or anything like that. They'll be fully disabled. They should actually become stationary in the air once we disable the motion source. So it'll basically maintain whatever position it was in before we disconnected from that player. So that'll keep things quite simple, nice and easy. So yeah. Now, last step for our VR pawn here is we need to be able to re-enable these motion sources once our pawn has become possessed. Now this is something we could have handled within the player controller itself as well. We could have set up an event here, gone to our player controller, and whenever we possess, we call some sort of event or a function or something of that nature. For simplicity's sake though, I'm going to go and stick right here in the VR pawn. And there's actually an event we can use. We can run on, let me see here. There we go, event possessed. Event possessed is what's called. So we're able to get whatever player controller is being passed through. However, we don't really need to find our player controller at the moment. It's going to be perfectly fine. You can also see it says it's server only, but this won't bother us in this scenario. So let me go and copy these, and we'll just want to bring these down, and just as our motion sources are set up here, we basically just want to set these back to whatever their default should have been. So for our left motion controller, we'll want to set this to left. For our right motion controller, we'll want to set this to right. And this will run once this pawn has become possessed, which will make things a lot easier for us here. Once the players become possessed, we'll automatically have our motion sources tracking once again. Now, I did almost forget something here while we at begin play. Now, unfortunately, all of our motion sources are currently set at the beginning. So we actually need to make sure that our motion sources are set back to none. And since we actually can't just go in here and we can't just set motion source to none anywhere within here, there's no none. What I'm actually going to do is I'm going to go and grab one set of the set motion source, and I'm going to go and bring this up, and at begin play, I want to go ahead and set motion source back to none. And that will just kind of fix that issue, because right now at the beginning, it will actually, all three players will have their motion controllers all moving, all in sync, which honestly looks kind of cool, but that's kind of not the intention here. We want to make sure that our previous player is or all the inactive players are not moving at all. They're completely within their stationary positions and they're not moving or anything like that. And yeah, so that'll kind of fix that little issue there. And now we can go and jump into VR and we can go and give this a quick little test run. All right, so I've gone ahead and loaded up the project here. Now, I don't know if you guys will be able to see it on whatever device you're looking at this on. But just slightly out of the ground, I can see one motion controller over there and one over here. Now I've actually taken what I believe is the very first one I put into the scene, which should be correct, since in the world outliner this one will show up first, so it'll show up first in the player controller as well. So if I recall, that's the second one that I will actually end up teleporting to when I go to next. And if I go to a previous, it would actually teleport me to that one. So we can actually test this out. I'm going to go and put my hand into a shape here so we can see which ones we're coming from. So there we go. And I was correct. That one's still unpossessed. That one is the one I just came from. You can see the motion controllers remained in kind of like a V shape there. And if I actually go ahead and press the left trigger, it should teleport me back to that one. So let's do a different symbol here. And it did. So that's actually the one I just came from. And if I go and press the left trigger again, what else can I do here? Let's do, I'm going to do like some weird symbol here. I don't even know if I can call this a symbol, just some kind of weird position here. There we go. And you can see that one was the next one. That one's the one I started out at. And I can continue going around like this. So if I press the left trigger again, let's do this. There we go. And you can see that's the one I just came from. That's the starting one. And I can, of course, go back to that one as well. Let's do this. Just doing a whole bunch of like random gestures here. But yeah, you can see as I go around, I'm able to go between all of them, and the motion controllers will continue to stay in position as I teleport around. I can't keep up with these as I'm teleporting around like I thought I could. But yeah, you can see that as I move around, everything else moves around with me. You can kind of see how my hands are very slightly moving as I go around. So yeah, so this is player position in VR. I just maxed something. There you go. And with that, that's how you go about possessing other players or player pawns within a VR game. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to hit the like and subscribe button down below. I also want to give a quick shout out to my Patreon supporters who you should see over here on the right hand side. And with that, I will see you in the next reality.